Our guest today on Decoding the Conflict Mindset is none other than Hanna Kelchner. And Hanna brings a very unique background to our Decoding the Conflict Mindset. Not only was she an attorney and has that legal mindset, but she's been a savvy consultant to businesses of all sizes and shapes throughout her years, including some of the big Fortune 500, and has taught at major business schools. What she does is actually teach managers and leaders on how not to fix employee engagement, but instead to do things differently. It's a result of her 30 plus years as a trusted advisor, of watching seasoned professionals underestimate the consequences of their business decisions simply because they didn't know what they didn't know. So she has both hands-on experience and as one of the chicken soup authors had to say for her, is that she's a lawyer you can love. So come on, listen. She's coming up next, Hanna Kelchner, and she has her own podcast called Business Confidential. And she's also the editor on the Journal of Business Ethics Education. And she was named a top 50 Twitter influencer by Dun & Bradstreet for what she contributes to specialty strategies. So if you want to learn from one of the greats, it's Hanna. So stay tuned, subscribe if you haven't already. If you have, great, we appreciate it, we love it. And pass on this next episode to all of the business leaders you know out there, whether they're entrepreneurial startups or they're heads of major organizations. You'll all learn a little bit from Hanna. Well, I am so excited to bring to you today Hanna Kelchner. Thank you so much for being here, Hanna.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Well, thank you. I mean, as I got to know a little bit more about your background, I thought I have to have her on this show because after all, the focus is decoding the conflict mindset. And you have a fascinating background. I know our listeners and viewers have already heard some of the details about your background, but, I find it interesting being both in business as well as a lawyer, some of the insights that you bring to that. And I know your focus is primarily on business. And so help us understand, there's always a story behind every person's life. And so what's your story? How did you get to where you are today?
My story? Oh my goodness. It's kind of a roundabout route, but I've always, at first I really didn't care for business. I grew up in an entrepreneurial family. And so I knew what kind of a toll it could take on family life. And I wanted nothing to do with it. And then there were some quirks that happened. Accidents of fate, if you will. And I wound up with a business degree. And I always wanted to go to law school because I like to read, and people would say I'd like to argue. Anyhow, that was then. But I found it to be very helpful that the two, I think, complemented each other very well. And I think having, had those lessons at the kitchen table about business, how things really work, was very helpful in giving me some insights to be able to counsel my business clients, especially my in-house work, because I could help them anticipate where the problems were instead of having it hit the fan. And then it's like, okay, how do we get out of this? So it was a lot more helpful to say, okay, here's what may be coming. Here are your choices. And, this is riskier. This is less risk. You decide what works for you, how you can sleep at night, because it's not going to affect my lifestyle, but it could affect yours. And so we worked together to come up with solutions. And so I found those two things to be very, very complementary.
Yes. Oh, I absolutely agree. So that's one reason I always like to hear about people's stories too, because like you, I grew up in an entrepreneurial family, and I swore I would never become self-employed, or start my own business. And I spent about 5 years in higher education working for the University of California, and funding were issues. And then too is that, I'm a hard worker. I was brought up on a farm, no less. But that kind of business structure doesn't reward people who are willing to put in 110% to get the job done. It's like, go to work at 8 and leave at 5, don't stay too late. And it's like, this isn't really working for me. And so I ended up going back into a small entrepreneurial company and been at it ever since.
I think that's what happens. People try different things, certain things may look appealing. And when you try it, you start to realize, I like it, I don't love it. But I really do enjoy this. And that's where you can shine. And I think that's really, what leaders need to do with their employees.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, some of our viewers and listeners can certainly resonate, looking at the family dynamics, of how we grew up and how it shapes and influences their decisions of today. We also share something else in common. I after my master's degree in education and counseling, I also went back for some law school and also a business degree. And but we got to cost accounting, and I said, done. I'm not going there. I learned enough.
It's funny that you mentioned cost accounting, because I took a lot of accounting courses as part of my MBA program, accounting and finance. And I was one course shy to actually sit for a CPA exam, and it was auditing. And I'm like, no, I'm not looking for people's mistakes. I just can't do that.
Well, it's a perfect example then of knowing what you like and knowing what you don't like,
Exactly. And sticking to your guns and getting there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I just was really intrigued, Hanna, with, the title of some of your materials. And one is, what is it? The 48 ways managers abuse their power and destroy employee engagement. I'm saying, wow, 48 ways. There's a lot of things people can do to screw up, but then 3 reasons why management should stop trying to fix employees to solve low employee engagement. So I really want to dive into that, Hanna, because I think that, the word engagement's been out there for a while, and certainly in the post-pandemic era, the world of work is still changing very, very much. What's your definition of engagement? I'm curious.
Well, I think engagement is about when people look forward to what they do, to their work, and they can give wholeheartedly. They feel comfortable in their employ. They feel comfortable with their skill set. They feel that they're growing, and they feel like they belong. They're part of something bigger than themselves. And I think that's something that we all want, that sense of belonging. And that's not always there, unfortunately.
Yeah. I like to say, we all have a financial need to work in some capacity, but unfortunately, work doesn't oftentimes feel very safe, very encouraging, very rewarding, and a lot of people just show up, to do what they can do to get by and get that paycheck.
Exactly. And so when you have someone such as yourself in this, educational environment who wants to do more, who has initiative and who has the drive, and you see these people that are sliding by, after a while, you start to ask yourself, like, why am I knocking myself out? Especially if you don't get the recognition. Yeah. It's one thing if somebody says, oh, Deborah, yeah, you really want her on your team. You want her on this project because she's well organized. She's an excellent writer. She can get things done, and that might make some of the others, the laggards, say, well, wait a minute, that sounds like a good project. I want to be part of that. And, that type of thing where it can, help motivate people. But when it's not rewarded, that's just one of the many things that turn people off. Which is why I say low employee engagement is not an employee issue, because nobody is more engaged than on their very first day at work. They're excited. You may have the situation where somebody is taking sort of an entry-level job, as a summer job or something, because it's just in an interim, and it's not intended to be, sort of their real world experience. They're in school. For whatever reason, they need to pick up a few dollars to make some money, and that's fine. But that's a limited situation. I think other people, when they get their first real job, they're super excited. They had to go through this process and the interviews, and they made it. And, this is it. I get to work at, maybe it's the company that's exciting. Maybe it's the person they're working for. They've got a big name. They can give them exposure. It's finally the industry that they're looking for. And it's opportunity. And then they get there at that first day of work, and they're a little nervous. They want to know what's going on, and want to figure out how things really work, because they know it's not quite everything was told in the interview. There's all this stuff sort of between the cracks, and they don't want to step in that. And that's really what it's kind of about, because as they learn what really happens, I call it, the norms nobody wants to talk about. Either they learn through the school of hard knocks, they have a mentor, they start to pull back a little. And so that's why it's like they're reacting to the environment that they're in. They didn't necessarily bring that, like, okay, how can I slide by until I can collect unemployment? There may be a few people like that.
Road.
Yeah, but hopefully they get weeded out in the interview process. I mean, you've got to have a rigorous recruiting process. They say hire slow, fire fast. There's a reason for that. And that's exactly it. So I don't think the employee brings the low engagement. Yeah. I think it's something that happens through attrition over time as they start to figure out how things work. And some they might be able to let roll off their back. Like, don't talk to Hanna before she's had her coffee. Those kinds of little things. Yeah. But there are other things that maybe really rubs them wrong, as far as their core values, or just a whole slew of things. And they start to pull back because they're, like you said, they don't necessarily feel safe, or as safe as they'd like to, in order to be as authentic and bring their full selves to the office.
Yeah. I'd like to just put out to all of our listeners and viewers to stop and think about that first day at their new job, and then, reflect on sort of the experience that they had, over how much time, and how that excitement, enthusiasm, all those things you talked about, Hanna, start declining.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I'd like to, as our listeners and viewers think about that, I'd like to know from you then, what do you tend to see as being, some top 2 or 3 or maybe 4 reasons of why that begins to happen? You touched on that, but let's be a little bit more explicit.
Well, I think the norms that nobody wants to talk about fall into, 2 big buckets, and they're both pretty big. So, one is sort of the systems and the individual structures at a company. Maybe there's poor accountability. And the other is what I would consider the interpersonal skills. People may have encountered a situation where they're doing really excellent work. They're being recognized, they're being rewarded. The person they work with is doing terrific. And something happens to that supervisor, that manager, that leader. Maybe they get promoted. Maybe they retire. Maybe they have a health issue and have to leave the company. For whatever reason, they're not there anymore, and their replacement doesn't think as highly of the same work, same caliber work. And all of a sudden, there's sort of this interpersonal conflict, and to me, all of these norms, the systemic ones as well as the communication ones, they're like a low-grade fever in a culture. It's like this underlying conflict. Every once in a while it spikes, and there's a little flare up, and then it kind of comes down. And I think after a while, it really consumes people, and they can conform, they can obey, but they lose a little bit of themselves. And some leave, and others, they just, my gosh, I know that we have a lot of remote employees these days, but back when everybody used to go to the office, you would see them slowly walk in, and even at the end of a long day, there'd be a little bit more bounce in their step. And so that kind of draining of energy, my gosh, think about how much it's lost in that process. So I really think that those norms fall into 2 categories. The communication piece, the interpersonal piece, because that's the stuff that, on a organizational chart, it's the space between the boxes. It's not the boxes or the title or the work that gets done in the boxes. It's how they relate to each other. And going to your point again, is it a safe space? Can I walk into your office and say, Dr. Deb, we have a problem? Or you're like, nope, can't deal with it. Nope. And we never get to it until it's too big to ignore. And then it's a crisis.
Yeah. Well, we certainly I'm sure we all have experienced, a lot of us have fear about conflict, and yet conflict in and of itself is not the bad thing. It's how we manage it. And so, if we deal with it at the lower level, it's much easier to navigate through and sort through and come up with some reasonable outcomes. But like you say, if we don't deal with it, it gets so big that now it's become an organizational issue, not just between two people, but now it's affecting others around them. And we certainly have seen, entire work climates or within team climates definitely impaired and impacted and not functioning well together. Yeah.
Absolutely. And not just within the organization. Sometimes the problem is so big, it goes outside the organization. And now you've got a public relations issue. You have not just a personal reputation, you've got a company reputation. It could take down a brand, can take down a company.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm curious, I like what you had to say as far as it's like on the org chart, it's the white spaces in between, and we know that we need that white space so that we don't get so overwhelmed. And so, what do you tend to see, again, we go back to, we talked about the 3 reasons why management should stop trying to fix employees to solve low employee engagement. What tips or strategies do you have for leaders? What tools do they have available? What mindset might they need to employ in order to take a look at this whole situation around employee engagement differently?
Well, I know this is going to come as a shocker, but I think they really need to look at how they use their power. Are they sharing it? Are they hoarding it? Or are they lording it over their employees? Because I think if they get so wrapped up in themselves and who they are and their title, et cetera, that they lose sight of the people who really want to help them. And they stop being curious, they stop listening. And they sometimes throw these employee engagement or employee satisfaction surveys out there, but then they don't like the results. That's assuming they got honest results, because, if a culture is so somewhat fear-based and a little bit toxic, people are going to be afraid to tell the truth because they're afraid of retaliation. So I think they really need to be able to step back and have somebody hold a mirror up and not get angry at them, and maybe it's not somebody that is in their workplace. Maybe it takes somebody else. And I know it's really hard because there's so much of the ego involved. But they really need to step back and get more awareness of how are they coming across? How are people perceiving them? Are they being understood? Where are the misunderstandings? Can they be cleared up? Why do they feel the way they do about certain contributors? And after you say why 5 times, you really kind of peel back the onion and find out what the real problem is, Maybe they just don't like them and they don't get along. Maybe they just have incompatible communication styles. The background. It's just the more people know about each other, the better they can get along. And people just put up these walls. What are they afraid of? But they need to understand that as leaders, they are asset stewards. And as an asset steward, their responsibility is to maintain or grow the assets, not to value them. Right. And I see that happening all too often with people's abuse of power. I mean, you mentioned that article, but yeah, all of those things are examples that have happened. I've had amazing comments from people who, I know number 2 and 3, and I've had all of these. So it really resonates with people, and I know that's one reason I'm kind of, blowing up that article into a book, because, if you look at, surveys, the level of engagement is historically low. It stays that way. It goes up a couple points, down a little, went up a little through COVID. Thank God I still have a job. My company's still in business, but, after that, it just, it's not good. It's not great. And so I think leaders can do better. And I don't think that they're all bad. I think they've had poor role models and they haven't been shown how to deal with conflict. you know, because I was just on my podcast interviewing somebody not too long ago about customer complaints. And she's like, it's a gift, you know, but how many people want to hear your complaints? You know, it's like compassion fatigue. Oh, for crying out loud, here they come again. It's the same thing. Well, if it's the same thing, listen, they're telling you how to fix it, how to improve it, you know, and I can understand that, you know, it's not fun to hear, but if you think of it differently, you know, that mindset shift, like you were talking about, that they're trying to help you. Now, maybe they're doing it in an inartful way by screaming at you, but there's a message there, you know, so step back and listen and hear what they're really trying to tell you. And you can improve. And I think the same thing with leadership. There's no perfect leaders. You know, everybody makes a mistake, and that's fine. And I think employees recognize that and can appreciate it when they're honest about it, you know, and say, look, I've had a bad day. This slipped between the cracks. Thanks for finding it. You know, we're in this together. Let me help you. You help me. And we're going to, you know, set the world on fire. We're going to do terrific things. But people get wrapped up in their power, with their title, with their position. Do you know who I am? Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
We really do.
And I don't really like what I see.
Exactly. Yeah. So when people talk about engagement, you know, I really think that the phrase employee engagement is a misnomer, because they want to be engaged. They're trying to be engaged. It's the leadership that's keeping them from being fully engaged. In their behaviors and in the systems and processes, you know, in their organization. So that's I think the solution.
Yeah. It really does, you know, behoove leaders and organizations to think about their you know, their situations differently. Well, I think there's a lot of fear-based behavior that goes on. You know, I don't want to. I'm fearful of being found out that I don't know all that I should be knowing, or I can't let myself be vulnerable. You know, in order to receive feedback that I might actually learn from somebody else. And oftentimes too, I think leaders, whatever level it might be, they feel they need to have all the answers. And so that can immobilize people into, I don't know what to do, so I'll make something up, you know, or I won't take any action on that because I don't know what the next step is. And yet leaders really are responsible for fostering conversations to get input from other people. And a lot of people, unfortunately, really don't know how to do that, except for reacting to blow-ups, and then they're not mastering conflict.
Right, exactly. You know, that's such an important point about them thinking they have to have all the answers. They need to have all the questions.
Yes.
They need to know the right questions to ask in order to get the answers, because nobody knows everything. And, you know, nobody's the Wizard of Oz. Well, maybe they are. They're behind the curtain.
They think they are.
Exactly. You know, and that's what I mean about the power play, you know. I mean, everybody knows, yes, that leader, that supervisor, they have the power to fire you. They have control. But it's exactly because they have the power that people need to feel safe.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's your livelihood. That's your paycheck. You've got bills to pay. So, you know, your choices about, well, do I flatter them and, you know, make them happy? Or do I tell them the truth? Can they handle the truth, right? Yeah. From that movie. You can't handle the truth.
Oh, I remember that line very well. Yes. Yeah. Well, exactly. and you've said this before, but, you know, the way I like to coin it, you know, to paraphrase in my words, is that how you show up matters. You know, how you show up, how you come across. And, you know, it's really we talked about the inartful way that people might do things. And if we sort of reframe our thinking about that, you know, it really is an art to be able to communicate effectively in ways that other people can hear us and actually respond to us. And that's really, you know, a skill set that unfortunately many of us may not have, or may be lacking, and we can polish it up. And so I like to say there's always room for improvement. Something doesn't go well. Okay, what can we learn from this? How can we navigate forward differently? And what do I need to change? And how can I influence change with you?
And even those small steps, you know, I think I remember one time when I was working in a large corporation, the head of the department, went on one of these retreats. And I'll never forget. It's like, well, he took a couple extra days off, and somebody goes, yeah, he's putting his layers back on. Yeah. And it's like, had he come back and tried to apply some of the things that he learned about being more open, being a little bit more transparent, that would have gone so far to fostering a little bit more togetherness and cohesion in the group, and eliminate some of the dysfunction. But no, he was home putting his layers back on.
Putting the armor back on, ready for battle, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And one of the other things I've seen a lot, and I'm wondering if you have too, is that, we all, I won't say we all, but many people want the opportunity to grow and move up in an organization, building on that knowledge, organizational expertise, and, expertise in their subject matter area. And yet oftentimes, and I think it's Ken Blanchard's institute that said, unfortunately, as people move up, it could be years before they get the proper training on how to actually manage people. They oftentimes get elevated for, how good they are at what they do, or, how smart they are in what they do. But that doesn't necessarily translate into managing the people, which then negatively impacts the employee engagement. And so, like you said, the ego, the power of the position, are you lording it over others? And having been a workplace mediator, I've seen so many conflicts in the workplace that do emanate from that new supervisor kind of role, where they haven't really had proper people training, and then they are mistreating their employees. And so I those have been my experiences. I'm not sure what you've seen in your organizational expertise.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's that lack of training, and sort of the assumptions that somebody who's now been promoted has about having the power. And I think Michelle Obama had a great quote when she said, and I'm paraphrasing, that power reveals who people really are. So depending on their core values, depending on what they see other senior leaders do in their organization, I think all of that influences how somebody behaves, because they think it's expected of them to be like this, or this is what they've seen other people who they deem successful behave. So what's their definition of success? Being able to say, you do as you're told, or how can we accomplish X, Y, Z? Are they inviting the conversation, or are they micromanaging or dictating? And as you pointed out before, a new supervisor may be fearful about, can I do this? I now have this responsibility. They are expecting X, Y, Z from me, and so they push that fear down through micromanaging when it's really not necessary.
Yeah, and that's probably the one thing most people just cringe at, is being micromanaged. It's a very stifling and unhealthy environment and mindset for the employee who's experiencing that. Yeah. I love it when people share quotes, and so thank you for sharing Michelle Obama's, and I wrote that down. I know I was in a meeting earlier today, and someone quoted John Maxwell, who always has great leadership quotes. But a leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. And so it really is, how you show up matters. And I like what you had to say as far as creating the conversations, and so. To me, it's really about, let's have a conversation. What can I learn from you because of how you see things differently, because of your role, your experience, whatever. It's not who's right or wrong. And too often people get positional and offer their opinions, and those are sort of fighting words, really. But instead, let's have a conversation. How do you see it? What can I learn from you? What can I learn from you? Okay, let's, with all those collective perspectives now, what seems to be the best way to go forward?
Exactly. It's the curiosity factor. That is often missing. And like you said, people may be afraid to ask the question because they're supposed to have the answer. And that's just starting off on a recipe for disaster, really. I mean, it works sometimes, but it's not going to work all the time.
Yeah, yeah. And there are times, I think it's some of the work Daniel Goleman's been doing, who's the author of Emotional Intelligence. He's really been redefining. I mean, the old school of leadership, shall we say, is that, being in charge, directing others what to do and so forth. But that really is old school. And today, the more and more we know about human behavior and, our emotional intelligence and things like that, I like what he's coined as situational leadership. What works for this type of situation? And I like to add into the communication styles that you referenced before, as well as conflict management styles. What's needed for this situation? So it's really about sizing up the situation, who's involved, and about how to show up as that leader then. Because you're right, not the same thing isn't going to work every time. Or we get back to Einstein, insanity is when you expect things to change when you keep doing the same thing.
Exactly. Because I think one reason some people are fearful of being too open or too transparent is they think somebody's going to take advantage of them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, I think when, somebody's up against the wall, it's going to be, Dr. Deb, what do we do? Mm-hmm. And they want your opinion and they want your direction, and it's not up for a popular vote. We don't have time to do this. And, and you provide that direction, that is your role at that point. So I think situational leadership is a great way to describe it, depending what the situation calls for. And again, that requires great awareness.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I know that you've taught at a couple of, 2 top MBA programs, and Duke's Fuqua, is that how you say that?
Yes, Fuqua School.
Fuqua School? Oh, okay. I've said it wrong every time I've tried to say it. I know a couple of people there too. School of Business and UVA's Darden School of Business. And so I'm curious, what do you find today's students really seeking as they pursue a career in business with an MBA? What are your observations?
Well, I have to admit, it's been a few years since I taught at either of those schools. But from what I can gather, I'm encouraged by the generation as far as their interest in breaking down some of the walls that you have in organizations. The challenge is these organizational walls. They don't come down easily. So I'm encouraged about the flexibility that they're looking for, things like that. And it's not that our generation didn't want that. We just didn't think we dare to ask for it. And I'm encouraged that the supply and demand, because they do have the demand curve on their side, where employers are looking, whereas for every seat that, we were looking for, there were 10 more qualified. You don't like it, there's the door, Deb, We got more eager beavers in the waiting room here. And so that is forcing the issue, which I think is good because it'll create a healthier environment. Now, will it happen overnight? Unlikely. I think it's going to take a long time, but it's encouraging that there's some glimmer of hope and that there's some progress being made, and at least the conversations are being had. And that over time, those best ideas hopefully will rise to the surface again if the power is shared and people aren't so afraid of it.
There's 2 things I'd like to add to what you just said, Hanna. Is that one is as a leader who seeks to learn, how do you see it? How do you see it? How do you see it? It doesn't mean you're giving away your decision-making authority. You're just simply taking the information in to now make a better decision based on more information. And so again, it's shifting that mindset a little bit. And then the other thing, so I've done a lot of work around, the intergenerational conflicts and things like that. And people are showing up differently generationally because they've seen what hasn't worked in the past, what's failed their parents or their grandparents. And so, lessons learned, how can we shape a better, more positive future because of what we've learned? Sometimes, again, those old school ways of thinking, we hold on to things when they don't really work anymore.
Right.
Now, I know that you're also the host of your own podcast, Business Confidential Radio, and tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about what you do on that show and the kinds of speakers that they might glean from your own podcast.
Oh, that's so kind of you for asking. Well, I have fabulous guests such as yourself. The mission of the show really is to help executives, managers, and entrepreneurs see business issues hiding in plain view. Because just as we were talking about, somebody rises into a leadership position, they don't have all the answers. And especially entrepreneurs that are just starting out, maybe they're solo, maybe they're starting it with a good friend or, their partner, what have you. They have a particular expertise. They don't know it all. And yet some of those things can really come back and bite you and hurt you. And so that's why the podcast focuses on a wide variety of topics. I interview guests, experts such as yourself, and it's sales, marketing, leadership, you name it. Every once in a while, I'll put my no-nonsense lawyer hat on and talk about, how to use emails appropriately.
But big topic, by the way.
Yeah, it is. And I chuckle every time I see a headline, I'm talking about a smoking gun. It's like, well, there you go. When I was teaching, that was one of the assignments, one of the very first assignments. Go through the newspaper or any magazine and bring an article that illustrates a smoking gun document. I had no trouble doing it. None whatsoever. So that's really the purpose of the podcast, to help people, see things that they should know but don't, or maybe that they knew and forgot. As a refresher. And so it's relatively short, but that is the goal. Help them be more successful.
Very good. I think I might have a guest for you, Bryant Galindo, who's been on my show a couple of times. So he works with startups and entrepreneurs and has a mediation background like myself. And so and does a lot around intergenerational. So I'll make an introduction for you.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. No, there's one more thing. I know that you have been on the editorial board of the Journal of Business Ethics Education. I mean, it. You're in there and you've been doing that for over 20 years. And so, I guess I'm just curious, again, if there's one or two things that you could share from your experience of looking at the ethics side of business, what might that be?
I think there's an increased awareness of ethics, but again, for the people that are curious about it, I'm glad to see that more schools are trying to include it in their curricula. I think there's still a long way to go. And so anything I can do to contribute to that is my pleasure, because it's not so much about right and wrong. I think, so much of it is like a 4-lane highway. Just don't go in the shoulder. You're going to get, you're going to have a rollover. You don't want to do that.
I like that. Good imagery. I think we can all identify with that.
We can identify with it. Yeah, exactly. You have to know who you are. And I think sometimes that's hard because of the financial pressures people are under. They make compromises, and sometimes the compromises are thrust on them through poor leadership. I've recently been doing some research into the concept of moral injury.
Oh, I like that term.
Yeah, it's
I don't like the outcome, but I like the term.
Yeah, exactly. It's an interesting concept where people are asked to do something that's not necessarily illegal. Okay, we're not crossing that line, but it's maybe a professional boundary. Or certainly an internal value that's like, you're asking me to do this and it's just not right. And an example, and this has come up pretty much in COVID, when resources were very scarce at hospitals, the pressure that nurses and doctors were under with very limited resources, right? I mean, they take an oath to do no harm, and yet they have to allocate.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just heartbreaking. It just, that's a moral injury. How do you measure it? How do you quantify it? Those are all separate issues. But I do think that people find themselves in that type of a quandary, even in the workplace, because of management abuse of power.
Very interesting point. Very vivid. I think we can all identify with some of this COVID-related issues and, what was happening in the news, and but a good slide over into the regular business world as well. Yeah. Well, Hanna, it's been delightful to have you here today. And again, I want to remind our viewers and listeners of her podcast. You can find it out at confidentialradio.com, and I'm sure they can sign up and subscribe there too.
Yes, I mean, it's on all the podcast apps. So some people have their favorites. They like, the Apple or what have you.
Yeah.
And so Business Confidential now, the businessconfidentialradio.com is the mothership where you can always find all of the goodies and the links that the guests have, because sometimes the individual syndicators, they don't have that level of detail. But you can still listen and get all the good advice from guests such as you.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, thank you for recognizing me as being one of your guests. I do appreciate that. Yeah. So, Hanna, if somebody wanted to reach out for you directly, let's say there's a leader, an organization out there, I think we need her in. How do they reach you?
I think one of the best ways is through LinkedIn.
Okay.
Let's connect, and we can take it from there.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, thank you again, Hanna, for being here. Again, talking about what leaders do and don't do in terms of employee engagement and how to change the direction of an organization and creating that. I like to call it the psychological safety to avoid moral injury and having those learning conversations, not confrontations. So, again, thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Deborah Dupree, your host and responsible for decoding the conflict mindset. So subscribe, pass the message on, share this show with others. I already think of a couple of projects. I know I'm going to have this as required listening or viewing for my participants. And so, again, we can learn from one another by sharing important ideas like this. So let's keep the message growing. And like John Maxwell said, leader's one who knows, goes the way, and shows the way. So be out there, share this information with everybody so we can make workplaces a much healthier and happier place to be where we can earn money. Thank you again. Join us next time.
Well, I hope you enjoyed what Hanna had to say about what managers should stop doing in terms of fixing employee engagement. It's a hot topic, but she gave you some insight and some resources to consider. Well, I can't wait to have our next guest come up, comedian Frank King. Now, Frank has a long-standing history of being a comic, and yet his topic is all about preventing suicide. He knows firsthand because of what he went through. He knows what it's like to have the barrel of a gun staring down your throat. What Frank has to say is where there's laughter, there's living. And so that says a lot in terms of what we want to do and paying attention to where people are coming from. Because we all have our dark days. We do. No matter who we are, how smart we are, how successful we are, we have our dark days. And Frank uses his humor to bring laughter and insight, but also giving people a voice to say what's going on for them. And not only has he done it for everyday people, he was also the writer for The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. So you've got to come back and hear the next episode. Frank King, comic, preventing suicide. Subscribe now, come on back, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Dr. Deborah Dupree, The Mindset Doc.